You're listening to The Streaming Wars, the podcast that discusses all of the latest happenings regarding your favorite streaming services. Find out which service is winning the war this time around.
Hello everyone, welcome to the latest episode of The Streaming Wars. I'm Dustin, Tony is back with me, and we are here to cover everything from June 30th through July 13th. We have a little bit of news to cover here and there. Emmys just got announced this morning, as a matter of fact, and we have a couple of other things, some of which are confirmed news and some of them are new rumors that have popped up, so we're going to dive into those. So starting off with the Emmys, because that is the most pressing and immediate thing. There's a couple of very interesting things with the Emmys. HBO and HBO Max, when you combine their nominations, they actually edged out Netflix. This is in a reverse to last year when Netflix actually had more nominations than HBO. But when you combine HBO and HBO Max's nominations, they actually surpassed. But the big headline is that Disney and Apple, they both landed at a ton of nominations. And technically, if you actually combine all of the companies within Disney, including ABC, Disney Plus, Hulu, Freeform, FX, and Nat Geo, they actually won with 146 nominations. But the gist of this is that Apple and Disney, they made a ton of nominations. When you look at HBO compared to HBO Max, last year they had a couple of opportunities for nominations. They didn't actually score any for specifically HBO Max programming, but this year they actually did land some from HBO Max. Apple had a ton of nominations for Ted Lasso, which is a huge jump from the 18 nominations that Apple received last year. As far as Disney Plus, they landed 71 nominations, led by 24 for The Mandalorian and 23 for WandaVision. So there's a ton of nominations there. But as we have said multiple times, whenever we talk about nominations in general, nominations and awards and all of that, you can tell that a lot of focus is shifting over to streaming, specifically because the level of content that is being produced for streaming is at much higher levels than typical broadcast, typical cable stations, and in some cases even premium stations. The content that's being produced is very high quality, which is going to garner a lot more of awards. So I think as we progress further into time, we're going to start seeing a lot more nominations coming specifically for the streaming services and less for the typical cable and broadcast channels that we've all have seen receive nominations for years and years and years.
Yeah, Dustin, I feel like this is just a pattern that started, goodness sakes, what was it? Probably whenever House of Cards was initially dropped on Netflix, right? That was kind of one of the few starts of, streaming shows winning a whole bunch of awards in nominations. This has been a trend that's happening for a while. I'm surprised by the article and kind of like the urgency of it saying, oh, hey, this is like a big thing. I don't know, just being a fan of streaming services for such a long time, I think it clearly makes sense that there's more nominations and streaming shows and platform shows than on cable television. If there's one thing that we know of award shows is that they love creativity. They love that novel storytelling. Like, how many movies have won Best Picture that nobody's ever seen, you know what I mean? And so with streaming services, you can reach you can do films that you want. You can do films that you don't have the pressure of the box office. You don't have pressure of, advertising money. You can tell a unique story on its own. And I think that that's why streaming shows have garnered so many nominations and awards the past couple of years, is because of, them able to do that. Whereas you look at cable television, I think that there's going to be a lack of investment by these companies into television shows. You probably see like a rise of like reality TV and stuff like that. But, just that high quality cable television, people's viewing habits have changed. And cable television is just tied to advertising. You have to, reach certain demographics. Right? You can't have certain shows. I think it's on Friday night because that's like one of the death nights or something. Like, you have all these different types of things. And so this is just, confirmation of a long-time trend of, streaming services are not necessarily dominating the nominations and awards in that sense. I think it's a ad hoc indicator of the level of creativity, at the level of success, at the level of excellence that some of these streaming services can provide in the realm of, television or movies, even podcasting, you know what I mean? So this is just indicative of a long-time trend.
All right, so then moving right along, the next bit of news, first it popped up on the information. The information stated that potentially Apple was interested in taking a look at having the NFL Sunday Ticket available on their service. But as it turns out, Deadline confirmed that it was actually the NFL that approached Apple with the potential of seeing if they were interested in potentially doing a deal for a Sunday Ticket. And I think part of it is they're looking at the biggest amount of money that they can get. And Apple has an insane amount of money when it comes to what they're capable of doing. The NFL Sunday Ticket is currently with DirecTV, but that is going to be something that's going to be leaving after the 2022 season. And when that does, there's been a lot of talk about who could potentially pick up the rights. Back in mid-May, Bob Chapek, the CEO over at Disney, stated that they were still looking at a possibility of bringing that over to ESPN. And then obviously with ESPN Plus, it opens up that opportunity as well. But whether or not that's actually going to happen is completely different. When it's specifically talking about Apple, the article does state that while Apple has the capital to do it, they're not somebody who seems to be very interested in getting into the world of sports as they have with, creating a lot of original content. Now, it's not to say they can't. Everything that we've seen from Apple TV Plus has been very modeled off of HBO's old model, where they're trying to create a lot of original content, fresh content, pick up movies here or there when they can, but go above and beyond with the original content that they're creating for the service, and high quality content that warrants the premium price that eventually they're hoping to charge, because right now it is a lower priced service. That said, by adding something like the NFL Sunday Ticket to their service, it immediately makes the value of that service jump significantly. Of course, they have to see a return, but they could see a return on it if, in fact, they land this and people are going to immediately switch over to whatever service it is that allows them to have access to NFL Sunday Ticket. So, do I see this potentially happening? I mean, if anybody has the money, there's only a couple people who do. I don't know that AT&T's out, but I don't know that Disney necessarily is going to have the amount of money to spend. The only way I could see this happening is if Disney increases the price of ESPN Plus significantly and includes it as at the base level. Right now, obviously, they have ESPN Plus. They just actually announced that there's a price hike, a $1 price hike coming in August for the service again, but it's still sitting very, very low in price in comparison to what, let's say, DirecTV is charging for access to NFL Sunday Ticket in comparison. So it is something, obviously, that they could also do a tiered thing. They already offer UFC pay-per-views on ESPN Plus for an added additional fee. So you could have that opportunity as well. You could bring NFL Sunday Ticket over and offer it as like a premium add-on to the service. That's a possibility. Obviously, that would be great for the potential of the Hulu and Disney Plus bundles that ESPN Plus is bundled with as well. So there's that. But there's not a lot of companies outside of potentially Disney, which it still seems very high, a very unlikely chance that they're going to be able to spend the money to get it as things stand right now. The other possibilities, obviously, Amazon has the money as well as Apple. Those are really the only two other players right now that have the money to really go in on the potential of having this access to NFL Sunday Ticket. Apple would get into sports very quickly if they were to do this, and they would probably garner a lot of subscribers, which by all accounts, that seems to be what they're really trying to get quickly here, because they're ending their free trial phase for iPhone owners that had been extended multiple times, and now they're at a point where they're going to need to start seeing growth and seeing a return on their investment when it comes to Apple TV Plus if they're going to continue to do what they're doing in the future. They have the money to bankroll things for the time being, but I think that this would allow them to get a subscriber count that would be high, that would be significant enough to warrant what they're doing with everything else. As far as the other possibilities with Amazon, I see that still as a possibility, but they also just picked up Thursday night football games, and they have, other deals in place with the NFL as well. I'm not sure that they're necessarily going to want to spend even more on top of everything else that they're doing, because it seems like a large amount. Apple seems like the most likely candidate at this point, just based off of the amount of money that they have available and the fact that it's not going to hinder anything else that they're doing as far as other sports deals that are in place, because they don't have any.
Actually, I'm going to push back on you a little bit. I think Amazon is the best contender, just because they've shown such an interest in just sports and streaming, just sports worldwide. They definitely have a good relationship with the NFL. Apple doesn't really make sense to me, just because that would be a risk for NFL. And if anything I know about the NFL is those owners want to make a whole lot of money and want to maximize the ad revenue as possible as they can. So that's why I don't think Apple's really going to be a good match, just in the long term. I mean, if I recall, Sunday Ticket was probably one of the most successful things of DirecTV. And so I understand, they want to shop that and do something. It's popular. People do enjoy it. They subscribe to a service that was kind of, dying for such a long time because of, NFL Ticket. I think ESPN Plus is a very interesting option, just to bolster their type of content. That's actually really interesting. But I agree with you I think shareholders are still trying to absorb and understand just the huge costs that have occurred with the Fox merger. And I think that there's not really a big appetite for, something this huge. I don't think Discovery/Warner Brothers Warner Media is going to be interested in this at all. So that's why I think actually Amazon's going to be the best option. I don't see, just because of the business models of NBC and Fox, and CBS as well, right? They're the three biggest in the United States networks that do NFL games every Sunday. And I don't think that either Peacock or Paramount Plus are going to try to pick it up, just because of potentially a conflict of interest due to the idea of seeing out-of-market games and from CBS or NBC. So that's why my conclusion is actually going to be Amazon's going to make the most sense. But go NFL for trying to shop a product that was highly lucrative for them. And yeah, we'll see what happens.
All right, next up, there's a couple of new deals that Universal has announced. First things first, if you remember last year during the Peacock Investor Day that they had back in January of 2020, they specifically mentioned the fact that they had deals in place with HBO to have what they call the Pay One window, which allows movies within the first level of being outside of home video and outside of theatrical to come to a specific platform. The deal was in place where HBO was paying money to license those films for their service. And at the time, Universal, or I should say NBC Universal as a company, specifically stated that they had no intention of getting rid of those avenues of revenue, specifically because that would bring money in for the company. Now, it turns out their tune has changed a year and a half later, because they've announced that they will not be renewing their deal with HBO. They instead will be bringing the movies over to Peacock. So the new deal will have the films arrive on Peacock 120 days after theatrical release. They will stay there for 4 months. After that, they will go to a Pay One window, which previously would have been HBO, but now instead will actually be Prime Video. Prime Video will have access to the Universal live action films in the United States starting in 2022, including the new Jurassic World film. And then on the other side of it, the animated films are actually going to be going over to Netflix during that same pay window, and this is a multi-year deal in place there too. And IMDb TV will have a licensing deal with other older Universal films as well. That's part of this overall deal. So the Universal Animation side of it is going to not only include Illumination, but also include DreamWorks, which are both currently under they're both currently under the company of Universal. They're both going to be coming over. So the big thing is Peacock is going to get a little bit of a push. Obviously, Paramount just did this thing where they have their films coming onto Paramount Plus 45 days after they release in theaters. That was a huge deal in and of itself. For example, Quiet Place 2 just released on Paramount Plus, and it's only been like a month and a half since it first released in theaters. So it's a big deal for these streaming services to get films on their services quicker. Meanwhile, you've got Warner Brothers, who is basically keeping their films within that same pay window. It's about 4 months after they originally release in theaters before they come back to HBO for a specific time period. But they do the same thing where they're licensing films elsewhere as well. So the big thing is Universal is going to be you're not going to be able to watch Universal films on HBO and HBO Max come 2022.
Man, Universal, just the string of these deals was kind of hard to just parse at first, just because there's so many complex parts that are happening. But I mean, I think we predicted this a while ago, and we definitely seen the Viacom CBS, how the executives, they were talking about how, yes, they have those individual streaming services, but they're still interested in licensing out their content to other streaming services as well. And I know some people are really keen to this exclusivity model, and I think that maybe certain IP should be exclusive to just the streaming, to their own streaming service. But I think there's no harm in having some of the content out there that's not really, doesn't bring in a whole lot of traffic onto the platform, to be licensed out to other streaming services, just because like they get that perpetual revenue from views and clicks on different platforms. It's just an easier way. It's another way to make money that's pretty passive, So it makes a lot of sense. It's interesting to see Universal, ABC Universal, and Viacom CBS. Those are two big, television giants just for such a long time. So it kind of reminds me of like the idea of like syndication, where their shows, their prime shows, after a certain time in a certain amount of episodes, like they might go to just another TV station just to be played. I don't know. It's kind of reminds me of that feel. And since those were two such giants in the field, that they're kind of copying that same model into the streaming services, into the streaming realm, we haven't really necessarily seen such enthusiasm for this plan from the other streaming services that are out there. Yeah, it makes sense. Good for Universal for making extra money. That's pretty passive, but it's interesting to see how these two companies are championing this idea more than the rest of the players in this market.
One thing I will say that's kind of interesting about this entire situation is that it does present a problem when it comes to some of the studio-based streaming services, meaning the streaming services that are basically led by a specific movie studio. Because as things progress, you're going to see a lot less crossover when it comes to Universal films on HBO Max, which is led by Warner Brothers. Disney Plus is obviously containing a lot of their stuff. They're still licensing some things here or there, but I think a lot of that has to do with existing deals that were already in place. But I think as things become more, as time progresses further along, we're going to start seeing a lot less crossover when it comes to this. All of the Disney content is eventually probably going to just be on Disney Plus. All of the Universal content will be just on Universal in the future. When you have a company like Amazon and Netflix, you're in a situation where you have to try to find content elsewhere. If you're not creating the content yourself, you've got to find content elsewhere. Obviously, Amazon saw the writing on the wall. That's why they're trying to, bring MGM into the fold with what they're doing. But then at the same time, you've got situations where HBO, which has notoriously had the blockbuster films from all of the major studios on its premium channel, now that it's got a streaming service, they're not going to be having those. They're not going to be able to land those deals without paying an exorbitant amount of money. So it creates a situation where the catalogs are going to be very, very separated when it comes to what studio owns which. And in the future, I think that it's either going to cause studios to start making a lot more original films for themselves. Case in point is exactly what Netflix is doing. Netflix is creating a lot of content. Not a lot of it's great, but there are some good things that come out of the content that they create. But it's because they don't have this massive library of content, and they need it. They can get some licensing deals here and there, but they cannot get licensing deals across the board when it comes to all of these variety of different studios. It used to be like that, but that's not the case anymore. And I think that we're going to see that a lot more going forward, where studios are going to be holding back their own content so that they can ensure that they keep subscribers on their specific platform. All right, so the next thing that we've got is actually a discussion point, which has to do with Black Widow. Now, Black Widow came out this past week. It not only released in theaters, as it was intended to be, but it also released on Disney Premier Access, which, of course, is that $30 charge for you to be able to watch the film in your house. Now, we've talked about Premier Access before, so this isn't really a rehash of what Premier Access is or how we agree or disagree with the use of Premier Access. But the thing that's important this time around is that with theaters kind of reopen across the country now and things on a steady path of getting back to normalcy when it comes to theaters reopening and box office returns and things like that, things are starting to climb. Movies that have released in the past couple of weeks have seen more money, not as much money as obviously pre-COVID, but they're seeing more money come in, and that's good for the movie industry. However, the one thing that's very important to note is that some of the services are specifically offering, well, it's really just Disney at this point, they're offering dual release. And Disney is in a unique position because they have content that is extremely sought after, not just by consumers, but also the theaters themselves. The theaters want Disney's movies in their theaters because they draw customers in, they will draw money, and that's a big deal for them. So Disney's in a very unique position where they can offer dual release and not have the criticism that you saw, for example, with HBO Max and Warner Brothers back in December. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that the movies that Disney releases, they tend to make a lot of money, and money talks in Hollywood, as they say. So Black Widow released, and Disney released numbers stating that they made about $60 million off of Premier Access by itself. Meanwhile, in theaters, they made $80 million in the domestic box office, and while they made $78 million in the international box office. Now, the $60 million on Premier Access on Disney Plus, that's actually global. So to put in perspective, they made over 1/3 of the total amount of money that they actually brought in was brought in on Disney Plus, while the theaters were bringing in money as well. So that's great numbers for Disney. I mean, there's no doubt about that. But what does that mean for the future of dual release films? Is this something that could continue? We know that there's at least a couple films coming up. Jungle Cruise is coming out just in, I think, 2 weeks, or I think it's 2 weeks from this week. Jungle Cruise is coming out, which is also being made available on Disney Plus Premier Access as well as theaters. And that's another Disney film that, of course, theaters are going to want. Not that I would expect it to make as much as a Marvel film or even a Disney animated film, but it's still going to be making a good chunk of money when it comes to the type, based off of the type of movie it is. So the real thing is, what does this prove now that we've got dual release? And there's been time. I mean, obviously, we've seen with some of the Warner Brothers releases like King Kong, Godzilla vs. King Kong, they had their own situation where they made good money, not great money, but they made good money. And obviously plenty of people were watching it on HBO Max for free. The real question is, now that we've had a little bit more time pass and theaters are getting back to normal, out of everything that we've seen with dual release movies, what do you think this means for the future of the theatrical model?
The future theatrical model has been bleak for such a long time. I mean, it was dying before COVID. It was dying before this idea of dual release. And when I mean dying, it's just the great age of cinema, the great age of just going to the movies, of hanging out on a Friday, taking somebody on a date, seeing something that's kind of going away. No, it's definitely going away. Theaters, popcorn's really expensive. Like, all the concessions are really expensive. Movie tickets, are expensive, but like they can't really affect that. So their profits are through the concession stands, and it's prohibitively expensive. Most of like the box office revenue that is generated in a single year, except let's forget like 2020 just due to COVID, but for the last probably 10 years has been a steady rise of either superhero / action movies, something like Fast and Furious, I would include in that group, right? Star Wars, then animated content, just because of how big like Frozen is and all these other movies. I mean, Raya made a good chunk of money as well. So I think that's pretty clear. Those are the two things that people really go to the movies now. I think putting animated movies on like Disney Plus dual release, maybe not charge $30 for them, but I mean like 15, that would be very that would be very attractive. And then maybe 30 for more adult content. Adult meaning like not G-rated, you know what I mean? Like PG-13 type movies. So I think that model would work really well because you would capture both the, kids, animated movie market and then also more of the adult market as well. I think HBO Max, I really like their decision of the dual release, and it has driven subscribers to their service. Some movies are going to do that more for others on certain months, but I think that it's definitely garnered. It made HBO Max an interesting service to get. And then there's extra content that's there that people really enjoy. But it was a good enticement, right? It's a good carrot. I think they made a mistake of not charging some amount of money for that content, $10, $15. I mean, Disney's charging $30 and they are, and people are still signing up for that service. That to me is the future of dual release, is you release it on the streaming service, right? So you have the exclusivity of only the customers on the streaming service. And then you pay like an extra premium of no less than $10 and no more than $30, in my opinion, right? I think that's the future model it's going to go, just because, people habits change. I mean, heck, look at like COVID, and now as the United States is kind of recovering from it, and especially like my area and then the field, the area that the field that I actually work in, software engineering, you really see just a change of how people are working from now working at home or a hybrid work environment versus just being in the office all day long. And I think that we're seeing something, and that affects the home life of people are have the option to be home more, to spend time with family at the house instead of going out for something. And, people's habits change. And I think that this is a time where COVID's accelerated that. And you need to meet customers where they are, as like content creation companies, is you got to meet people where they are. And that could be at a theatrical experience where they just want to enjoy something magical, or they want to be at home and just chilling on the couch with family, or just after a long work day, just trying to find that place to just relax. That to me is the future of a quote unquote cinematic experience, is you're meeting people where they're at. And I think that there's going to be some type of premium charge, not crazy, but just something to capture some of that extra revenue there. I think that if you're going to do that, companies need to report the earnings from the almost pay-per-view, right, of that surcharge. Then you report that alongside the box office numbers. I think that's very important, especially for like content creators. They need to have access to that data just because of how contracts work, right? There may be times where it's, certain actors or producers get a certain percentage of just the box office, but if you don't include, right, the streaming service revenue, then that's not necessarily part of the box office, which means that the creatives don't get a cut of that pile of money. So I think that these companies do need to include those numbers. I was really proud of Disney that they did. I think they still didn't like post how many people watched it or the users, right? Because all streaming services just for some reason did really dislike that. So, but they did disclose the number, and I think that's hugely important. But in terms of like the cinema side, right, just solely focus on that. I mean, things have just changed, and there's going to be a new normal. It's going to hurt a lot of theaters and the workers there, and I'm very sympathetic to that. But it's a trend that's happened for a long time and just seeing how COVID has been, and the idea of dual releases being so convenient for people to meet them where they are and to capture revenue from that, as well as the theatrical experience. Theaters are just it's going to evolve. It's going to change. And you've seen some of that with how like AMC has definitely invested and reinvented a lot of their theaters to provide like bigger seats, the like subwoofer, true experience. Some of them have like restaurants on the inside, and you can get food brought up to you. And so they've changed it up a little bit, but this is the new normal. And as much as theaters are going to really hate it, and as much as creatives are going to be so upset for some reason that their great movies should not be watched at home on a 50-inch 4K TV, because those are really cheap and inconvenient, right? There's going to be some growing pains, but you're going to see some directors who are just going to be, pushing that charge of, hey, our story needs to get out there and seen as many people as possible. I think that's kind of the allure of streaming, is that you have creators who can tell a unique story, and they can reach a large amount of viewers more than they could at the box office, because for some of these smaller movies, people are just not going to go to the box office for. But if I saw a very unique smaller film on a streaming service, I would definitely check it out, just because that would be easier for me to do. Like Into the Heights, I really enjoy that movie. I would have not gone to the theater for it, but I really really did enjoy it on HBO Max and definitely was worth the $15 for that month. So I think that's where creatives it has to be in the theater. I think that's kind of where their opinions are going to change. And I think you're going to really see in the next few years a real buy-in from these creators of, okay, let's embrace meeting people where they are at homes on smaller experiences. But I think you're still going to have like directors like Chris Nolan who are going to be very pissed that this is the way how things are going to go. And he's going to still try with 35 millimeter film that's not really produced anymore, and try to get people to be at the theaters and put up a stink when maybe one of his movies is going to be on a streaming service too soon. So,
all right. So with that is going to wrap up this episode of the Streaming Wars. We're going to try to keep our episodes a little bit shorter. I know we had some comments on the last episode that you guys are enjoying, or at least some of you are enjoying some of the shorter episodes. So we're going to try to focus on the big news and discuss it concisely, so that way you guys have an update of what's going on with the Streaming Wars. But we're going to try to keep these a little bit shorter, just because there also, as I've stated countless times over the past few months, there's just not a ton of news that is worth talking about every single 2 weeks that we do an episode. So that is it for this episode. If you are interested, all of the things that we've talked about here, as well as other things that have happened over the past 2 weeks, are available in our show notes, which can be found at our website, thestreamingwars.io. In addition to that, you can find us on YouTube, and we have a playlist for each and every one of the streaming services and the trailers that release for those streaming services for the new content. You can take a look at that, as well as all of our episodes of the podcast. Wherever you're listening to this podcast, please take a moment to leave feedback. That is always greatly appreciated and helps the show get to a larger audience. In addition to that, you can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, as well as join our Discord. That is where you'll find other people to talk about stuff related to the Streaming Wars as well. You can also send us an email at thestreamingwars@gmail.com with any questions, comments, concerns, or topics you'd like us to discuss on future episodes. And as always, thank you so much for listening. Please be safe out there, and we'll see you guys next time.
Thanks for listening to the Streaming Wars. Check us out on Twitter and Instagram. Also, consider supporting us on Patreon. Links can be found at thestreamingwars.io.